It's generally recommended that one begins a monologue, presentation, or story with a joke or some detail that gets your audience on your side. I'm not good at any of the above, so let me just say, I've never been really fond of dogs. Now, I have had pet dogs as a child, but even then I wasn't super enthusiastic about it. They generally scared small child me because I was a literal small child. Third shortest in my class until 6th grade, at which point my class only had 4 students. Then I was second. And so most dogs were bigger than me, resulting in more than one occasion where I was convinced the big barking beast before me was intent on eating me up. Eventually, I grew up and got over being afraid of dogs, but have still never become fond of them. I typically find them to be dumb and loud, and I already work in retail, so I don't need to deal with 4-legged versions of the general public. So when I was asked to be a one-man audio crew for a documentary about dogfighting, obviously I said yes. I should clarify, I don't care for dogs in general, but I am against the act of abusing them and forcing them to fight each other. Obviously, the film's premise was also anti-dog fighting. More specifically, the premise was that we were to follow around a local mixed martial arts fighter who was supposed to be retired due to a heart condition, but wanted to do one last match to raise funds and awareness for an organization that helps rescue dogs from dog-fighting conditions. A fighter for the dogs who were forced to be fighters themselves. On a normal film shoot, being a one-man team in any department isn't necessarily ideal, but considering the in-the-moment cops-style filming we were going to be doing for most of the project, it was probably the best method for both audio and camera. The downside for me was I hadn't used real audio capturing equipment in several years, and so I was slowly trying to relearn everything as we were going, which was fine for when I only needed to use the equipment I had prior experience with. However, when I ended up in situations where I had to use equipment that I didn't have experience with, it turned into a nervous mess. A lavalier microphone is a small microphone one attaches to the person they intend to record audio of. Usually wireless, except for one cord that goes from the mic to the small box which powers it and sends out the signal to the receiver for recording, or does the recording itself. Like this one I'm using here. I had never used one of these devices until this shoot, and the first person I had to try and put it on was a small child. There were a handful of different clips for attaching this microphone to this child's clothing, but their clothing wasn't of a style that made it easy for hiding. Not knowing the best approach based on experience, as I had none, I chose to use a hat pin style post for attaching the mic, like the kind you find on an enamel pin. I applied it nervously and poorly, and the child, being a child, tended to fidget and squirm. As a result, the part of the pin that holds the mic in place and covers the sharp, pointy part fell off after the first take. I didn't realize this because I wasn't checking the mic after every shot, but I could hear the child complaining to their parent that they kept feeling a poke from it. I could also hear their parent telling them it wasn't poking them and they should quit complaining so much. I didn't actually piece together what was going on until we were done and removed the mic from them. Now, this film isn't about child abuse, though it was about dog abuse. And so one of our next scheduled shoots was to go to a local gym and interview former UFC legend Ken Shamrock, a man who happened to be in town for a fight of his own and someone the man that we were documenting looked up to greatly. We started by filming the two meeting at what seemed to be a bit of a surprise to Mr. Shamrock. I don't think his agent or whoever our producer spoke with explained the documentary aspect to him very well, but he was cordial, and we filmed some of his workout routine alongside Gordon, who was the man that we were following for the film. Filming a man meeting his hero is all well and good, but not necessarily great cinema, so we scheduled to film a proper interview with him later. We mentioned the subject of the documentary being about dogfighting and how it's not good and stuff. He agreed to the interview but said he wasn't sure how much he could really say, and then left. Not a great sign, but he did show up for the sit-down interview as promised. The interview went fine and was mostly boring fighting man talk stuff. Eventually, we did get to the subject of dogfighting, and then it got real tense real fast. Essentially, Shamrock started on the subject by saying he didn't like dogfighting, but he had some friends who were into it. They backed and forthed on that for a while, until we got some usable footage of him not sounding like a complete ass. And I believe that's what ended up in the final documentary. It was a depressing post-shoot conversation, though, as Gordon dealt with learning a hero of his did not support a very positive cause that was important to him. Cringeworthy washed-up wrestlers aside, we continued on with our shoot schedule. The shoot days that stand out in my memory the most were the couple we spent tagging along with the Humane Society's Animal Rescue Squad. We actually rode along with a pair of persons whose job was to go into the shadier parts of Detroit and investigate homes where dogfighting and other animal abuse situations are purported to be occurring. These were potentially very dangerous situations, and we had to be there in the thick of it, ready to run or take cover if needed. My audio gear was thankfully not too cumbersome. In fact, it all fit nicely in a little satchel aside from the boom pole that I had to maneuver in and out of the van door and try to be mindful not to smack anyone in the face with. I also had a couple of people mic'd up with the lavaliers again, but attached correctly this time. The heaviest piece of equipment I had to deal with was the bulletproof vest we were given to wear. I was a bit surprised when I showed up that day and was informed I would need such a thing, but once we started entering certain neighborhoods, I understood why. Thankfully, we were riding along on daytime investigations, and we were in a clearly marked van, so anyone who didn't want attention from us could easily run off before we actually stopped and got out. Most of the houses we visited were empty, though. One, despite appearing empty, did in fact have a chained-up dog on its property. Because of the evidence present and the condition of the dog itself, the Humane Society guys chose to remove the dog from the house. The poor thing had scars and fresh wounds around its neck, indicating some dogfighting training techniques, so it definitely seemed like the right call. Once they got him back to the offices, he was bandaged up and able to begin rehabilitation. While there, we were shown another dog who wouldn't be so lucky. His wounds were just too extensive, and he would likely be put down. We never had any confrontations with anyone while out on these investigations, but there was one house we visited which had evidence of recently hosting a dogfighting event. While we were in the yard checking for a way in, we did notice a car clearly watching us, and so things were a bit tense there, but eventually they drove off. Which was certainly for the better, because I later learned the specific type of vest I had been given wouldn't actually stop most types of bullets, just slow them down. The only other bit of drama on that shoot was actually on the day of the MMA match that all of this was supposedly building up to. For the entire shoot, we were working the angle that it would be the big, final match of Gordon's career, with him facing off against his rival that had beat him in his previous retirement match. We interviewed a manager who clearly had some mob ties, and they even did a weigh-in confrontation, all leading up to this big revenge match. And then on the day of the match, as we're at the venue planning our shooting strategy, Gordon gets a phone call informing him his rival was backing out of the match, leaving him with no opponent, and the documentary with no finale. Personally, I thought there was sufficient cinematic drama in continuing with that story. After all, most documentaries take years to film because of things like that, and waiting for what feels like a proper ending. Nobody else involved seemed to see it that way, however. Some phone calls were made, and some rando was recruited to be Gordon's opponent for the night. I think he had fought Gordon once before, but definitely hadn't beaten him. In a bit of a professional wrestling twist, we even did a locker room interview with the opponent and asked him to, essentially, play the heel, going so far as to feed him some lines echoing the sort of things Shamrock had said and speaking poorly of Gordon's anti-dog fighting mission. And that was it. We did a couple of follow-up interviews, but that was the end of my experience as a one-man audio crew on a team hunting dogfighters. Not the most harrowing tale, I suppose, but it was an experience I'll certainly always remember, and the Humane Society facility we filmed The Small Child at is where my wife and I went years later and adopted our current cat child. So, that's pretty cool.